changes afoot that you can see in the UK and the USA particularly, in terms of Western self-understanding and Western civilization and what we're calling the culture wars, I think they are very, very significant. And we're at a moment which could end up being as influential on the 21st century as the immediate post-war period was for the remainder of the 20th century.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Jacob Phillips on Western civilization resurging from the culture wars and why Britain should not let the English identity disappear.
I don't think cultures and societies can work very well unless there is a sense of what the home culture is.
Yeah.
And I think in England that needs to be Englishness. And those who say otherwise are not thinking realistically about what's achievable in terms of social cohesion and identity within a nation.
Jacob says obeying societal rules and traditions provides a path to freedom.
In my youth, I'd known many anarchists and people that had sort of experimented with these kind of extreme forms of anti-authoritarianism, and they ended up the most restricted, enslaved, limited people I've ever met in my life.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with author and theologian Jacob Phillips. Jacob, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
I wanted to start with talking about Englishness. I was on the UN website for some reason, the list of countries, there's no England, obviously there's UK. But if we look at the other countries in the UK, they have quite a strong national identity. They've got their own parliaments. There's not really an English parliament as such. And if we look at the military, there's the Scots Guard, Royal Welsh, Royal Ulster Rifles. Not much of an English unit. I mean, where is Englishness now? What does it mean to be English?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because I think one of the things that's been authentic to Englishness historically is that it's had a certain self-confidence, certainly in relation to the other Celtic nations, whereby it hasn't actually needed to have this slightly contrived sense of self-confidence in its own identity. And you see this particularly in the fact that people will talk of English literature. They won't talk about British literature, but they mean British writers when they say English literature. And I guess the challenge we have now, really, for Englishness is whether that natural posture, which fits many of the values of Englishness insofar as it's self-effacing, has a certain delicacy, a certain distaste towards overbearing, verbose kind of expressions of self-confidence, whether that can still be sustained in a period whereby that natural, unreflective self-consciousness in English identity and the great goods and benefits of English culture is no longer nearly as prevalent in the education system. It's not something many people have, and actually the brand, if you like, of Englishness is increasingly seen as something problematic, toxic, with a terrible past and hardly any redeeming features apart from its ability to transgress itself and apologise for itself. I personally would like to think that Englishness doesn't need to go down the road of becoming, in England, simply one expression of a group identity alongside others. I don't think cultures and societies can work very well unless there is a sense of what the home culture is.
Yeah.
And I think in England that needs to be Englishness. And those who say otherwise are not thinking realistically about what's achievable in terms of social cohesion and identity within a nation. People might look to the States, where things are a lot more contentious and race relations are a lot more contentious. But the difference is, obviously, the circumstances of the United States of America's founding are very different to the history of Englishness and the longevity of English culture. And indeed, the huge number of just great gifts Englishness have bequeathed to the world, along with the same level of moral ambiguity that many other nations have. So I do think Englishness exists. I mean, I do think that we often we neglect the degree to which it affects people's behaviour, deep cultural conditioning around Englishness. And when I first went to the States, when I was, it was about 2010, I was really shocked at people commenting that I was very English. Yeah. I'd never thought of myself as particularly English.
In a good way or a bad way, were they commenting?
It was mixed, but mostly in a good way, in a sort of slightly twee way, holding doors open for people and not being overbearing and verbose, things things like that, you know. And generally, you know, in an academic context, somebody pointed out that when English academics begin a paper, they will often begin with a quick apology, and how they found this very quaint and charming, this habit of always apologising for oneself, and things like that, which I'd never thought of. I wouldn't have thought of myself as English. At that point, I was actually quite left-wing, and it actually led me to reflect on how many of us are affected by Englishness. Many English people are affected by Englishness in a way that they're not necessarily fully aware of, and that's what interests me, that very sort of delicately unreflective way that people's behaviours and their postures and the positions they take are affected by their culture, which to me is far more meaningful than flag waving and singing songs and arguing with people about things.
If we look at the census of 2021, 15% of the population said they're English. Most prefer to go with British. You know, if someone flies a St George's Cross, it's kind of seen as archaic, bigoted. You know, how did Englishness get such a bad reputation? Can we or should we do anything about it?
I think we should do something about it, because I think it's impossible to really disambiguate the images, the cultural expressions and the emblems of Englishness between sort of toxic and non-toxic. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. In recent years, there's a fair bit of snobbery involved. I mean, we have a cultural elite who have a particular, you know, quite radical belief system around identity politics, and a particular understanding of history and the sins of the past in relation to that. That's all very well documented. Many people have commented on that. But what is often missed is, I think, just a standard and actually very English element of snobbishness related to that, whereby the St George's flag is seen as working class. It's associated with football, with thuggery, the EDL, that kind of thing. And therefore, something like the St George's flag, which is actually a very, very ancient Christian symbol of the resurrection, ultimately, is mistaken as some sort of cipher for kind of thuggish violence, which it isn't and wasn't originally. So I think we're in this position where there's a very amnesiac approach to English history, which takes a very sort of present-day view on everything, where you've got all this snobbishness and stuff, combined with a vast kind of rereading of history, which nearly always stops in the early modern period, with the beginning of empire. And actually all these symbols and emblems, and indeed the mentality itself, goes all the way back to Beowulf and beyond, far further back in time, into periods that people don't learn about in school to the same degree that they used to.
Putting Englishness aside, according to the government, there are British values. We've got democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, respect and tolerance for other beliefs. I mean, some people would say they're not really very British, they're more kind of universal values. If I decide I'm an anarchist, do I lose my passport? I mean, what are your thoughts on these as a sense of British values?
I mean, I think each of them does have a certain lineage in Britishness and to a certain degree Englishness. My issues with them really are in the presupposition that really came about shortly after the 7/7 bombing in, when was that, 2005, I think, when all of a sudden, well, actually there were riots a few years before the Bradford riots, and then 7/7, and the issue of what was called quote unquote social cohesion became an issue, and the fact that there were significant portions of the country whereby there was a very hard division between the different communities and ethnicities and cultures and religions living there meant that various policymakers and theorists sort of came up with an idea to bring social cohesion back to these isles by getting people to subscribe to particular values. I have a problem with that method rather than the values themselves. There's something in the values, but I think there's a lot more that could be in there and they could be much richer. But I think this sort of top-down, sort of policy-orientated method of naming a few abstract principles to which people can subscribe, and then getting primary school children to learn them, which is what they do. You know, I have a child at primary school, and they learn these values and stuff. I'm not sure what it really achieves if you compare it to the sort of development of identity and the virtues that would be attended within a particular worldview of identity, combined with culture and religion, which would be far more vital and all-encompassing understandings of the good. To say that someone respects British values, what does that really mean? So you respect democracy, does it mean you vote or you don't vote? Does it mean you don't fight against democracy, but you tolerate living in a democracy? We all know there are boundaries on what can be tolerated and what can't be tolerated. Everyone has a boundary somewhere. And, you know, many people would say, certain communities would say they respect the rule of law insofar as they're in a position where it's in their advantage, it's advantageous for them to do so, but that might change where there's significant demographic change in the future. So I don't think respecting a value necessarily captures that fully rich, embedded sense of what people almost unanimously revere as good in a society.
Do you see a space between, say, those values and kind of ethno-nationalism, somewhere kind of in between those, that we can find a Britishness?
Yeah, I think between these two extremes is really the realm of culture. So on one hand, you've got ethno-nationalism, which ends up becoming about biology, ultimately. And I think therein lies inevitably significantly problematic territory. This world of values that we're talking about ends up a kind of amalgam of different things, with people subscribing to these very broad, abstract, general principles. The way in which culture affects behaviour and the way in which culture pulls people together is something which takes many years to become embedded in different communities. It also requires that particular communities will assimilate better than others according to the strength and the character of their own culture and religion. And I suppose it does require a certain caution around the scale and the scope of immigration, more than the values model does, but without, let's say, the sort of the radical conclusions that might come from the ethno-nationalist way of approaching it. But I think my own experience, and I've spent the vast majority of my life living in London. I spent my teens living in East London at a time which was multicultural and multi-ethnic and multi-religious, far before the rest of the country was. There was a real sense of belonging and shared identity among many of the people I knew and among my school friends, which came from being Londoners, and did genuinely seem to transcend ethnicity. And I look back to that now and I reflect with people my own age on occasion. I'm in my mid-40s, and only recently I was reflecting with someone whom I'd known for many years, and we were saying it's odd that race has become more of an issue in our lifetimes than it was when we were adolescents, and we never would have predicted that. The prediction was always that race would become less and less important. And to our shock, you know, race has become a huge issue among the younger generations. And I think part of the problem of that's a consequence of the fact that the sense of a shared culture and the expectation that a culture would be shared among people has been lost. And we've ended up with a cultural fragmentation, of which the most obviously visible sign of that is ethnicity, because that's what people often see.
You write in your book about the music scene back in London in those times, and the underground record shops and stuff. There's a sense that there's no need to kind of force people to, you know, not be racist and to kind of mix together, because everyone's just doing it naturally. And then the kind of authorities get involved and try and force something on everyone, and it kind of makes things worse.
Yeah, I mean, that was very much my experience. The record shops I spoke of, I mean, it was a particular moment in time, and it was really a particular locality in London that these record shops were around. But they seemed to me the opposite of this position we're in at the moment, where race has suddenly become the foreground of everything again for many people. And there's much like the values approach to social cohesion, there's also a particular type of anti-racism, or so-called anti-racism, I'd say, which has a whole nomenclature of principles and values which are frequently disconnected from the way people live. If you throw human beings into the same space for a significant period of time, they will inevitably begin to behave cohesively and to develop, you know, commonalities and shared ways of life. And very often people fall in love. I mean, Britain has far more mixed ethnicity marriages, I would suspect, than anywhere else in the world, possibly in London. People do come together quite naturally. When that begins to fail and things begin to fragment, it simply doesn't help, I think, and the point I tried to make in the book, it simply doesn't help to have this very elite top-down, very abstract way of trying to enforce that upon people. And what really frustrated me, and I think I give an example in the book, if I remember correctly, was being in kind of classic sort of 2020 period critical race theory, unconscious bias training class for academics from someone who'd clearly never actually lived in a situation of ethnic plurality herself, because of the way in which the things that were being said were just so alien for those of us that have lived in such circumstances. On the one hand, very naive, on another hand, very cynical as well. It was very strange. You know, my wife's of Middle Eastern origin. My father-in-law is Iranian. And I ended up having a lively debate with this woman who was telling me that it must be very difficult for me being married to a woman of colour, which isn't a title that my wife's ever taken upon herself. A woman of colour, when there's such a discrepancy of power dynamics between my wife and I. And it was something that was completely alien to our relationship, and we just laughed about it. But this was supposed to be anti-racism. And the completely natural, unreflective, peer-to-peer relationship that my wife and I have nurtured over many years was somehow racist. And it just didn't make any sense to me.
So there's a lot of talk these days about culture wars. I mean, do you ascribe to this idea that there's a culture war happening?
I do sometimes, yes. Sometimes, I mean, I know lots of people who I think are probably subscribe to it a bit too enthusiastically and are in danger of becoming culture warriors or culture warmongers.
I know that, culture warmongers, that's a good term.
Culture warmongers. And, you know, social media and the internet often doesn't help people keep a sense of perspective, and I've probably been guilty of it myself on occasion. But I do think there's a character to the discourse in the last 7 or 8 years or so, which is different to the character of the discourse if we go further back in history. And it's characterised by, firstly, by the refusal of both sides to countenance the possibility of the alternative opinion. So this began particularly with the left calling the right toxic or problematic, etc. It happens on both sides. So there's no room for rapprochement. It's the coldest of wars because it's without genuine aggression. It very rarely, very, very rarely actually involves aggression, as in physical aggression. And it's also characterised by this clustering of different causes. You get this omnicause effect, where you have two sets of omnicauses. And it's very difficult for someone, say, socially conservative, to be very ecologically concerned now. It wasn't that difficult 7 or 10 years ago, and you get people like Roger Scruton and others who are, you know, deeply conservative and profoundly concerned about the future of the environment. That's getting harder now because net zero has become one of these issues. It's one of these divisive issues. It is different to, when I look back on you know, resources and do research on periods sort of pre-2010 and certainly the 90s, which is, you know, what I've focused on a lot historically, you don't have this sense of clustering omnicauses. There's much more scope for people to take individual positions on things and have much more nuanced positions on things. And I think some of the fundamentals that people are arguing about are basic fundamentals of what makes for meaningful, constructive human life. And if you're talking about biological sex stroke gender, you're talking about religion, you're talking about the possibility of collective identities and nationhood and culture, these are really fundamental things. And if people are disagreeing about things on that level, then it's difficult to deny that this does qualify as a culture war, because ultimately a culture is a whole way of life. So every way of life is brought into it. And it can be signified, one's positions in the culture war can be signified increasingly in all kinds of means of everyday interaction. The most obvious one being, you know, pronouns in an email signature, which I really resent that development, regardless of how one feels about pronouns. I resent the fact that everyday communication, affability and enjoying the company of others is now always sort of scarred to some extent by this need for people to signal where they sit in relation to these very divisive issues. I think it's really sad.
What you were talking about there was a basic kind of value of Western civilization. You and I may have totally different opinions, but I can listen to you, you can listen to me, and we can be polite to one another. Whereas now it feels a bit like everything's a battle.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that's the case, and I think it's easy to blame the online world, and there's no going back before the internet, and a huge amount of good has come from the internet. So I'm not a Luddite about technological progress or anything like that. But if you look at the kind of, I think often, you know, the everyday workplace for many people has a kind of basic level of affability and functioning and politeness. And what the internet, what social media and related forms of digital communication have enabled people to do is have kind of is manage conflict in a kind of safe and sanitized way online.
So I'm behind my screen, you're behind yours, and it doesn't matter that I'm
Exactly.
saying bad things about you, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember the last time. It might be a reflection of where I work. I don't know, but I can't remember the last time I've been in a very heated exchange in the workplace. When I started working in the city in the early noughties, people would shout at each other. There was aggression in the workplace, not in a criminal sense, but just in the sense there was a certain measure of, there were heated, full and frank exchanges of views and a certain heatedness.
Did you feel that was a healthy thing?
Yeah. And I know, I mean, I've got one friend that would say it's also a reflection of having, it's also a differentiation of the sexist thing as well. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think there might be something in it. So in a position where senior leadership roles were more male-dominated, historically it meant for a slightly more aggressive workplace. I'm not entirely convinced because I happen to be a very non-aggressive person and also male, so I'm a bit conflicted about that. But I think, yeah, there was a pressure valve which you simply don't get. You don't get the same cathartic effect through the sort of slightly painless and very protected form of expressing aggression online, I don't think.
In your book you compare the death of a civilization with the death of a star, and this black hole opens up and it kind of sucks the life out of things. I mean, do you think to some degree that's kind of where the West is at?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that particular chapter where I wrote about that, you know, it was partly the moment. I remember when I wrote that chapter, it was pre-2020. It was at the end of 2019, and it certainly, what was driving that at the time was, excuse me, was thinking about trying to understand really the way in which academia and particularly the humanities have become so identitarian, which I was railing against at the time. And I didn't feel that it was kind of driven by this sort of ideological passion in most of the people that I saw it in, and the real kind of apparatchiks of the regime, if you like, tended to be sort of HR type people. And you know, these weren't people that had been radicalised through reading critical theorists or anything like that. It just seemed to have this like quality of it sort of developed this sort of inevitability about it, insofar as people often they didn't have a value system to hang on to, so this had kind of moved into that vacuum space. Entropy, that's the word. It kind of seems this response to entropy, which you get when a star breaks down, which really got me thinking. So it seemed like people desperate to impart meaning into meaningless stuff. And this was the most obvious kind of value system in the culture at large by which to do that. I think in 2020 things did slightly change because there was COVID, there's what people call the woke explosion in the summer of 2020, and many of the people I was writing and discussing things with became a bit more constructive in response to that period, actually, and started thinking about constructive alternatives and articulating difference. So that was a point where the focus was a bit more on simply interpreting the cultural phenomenon rather than trying to think, where do we actually go from here? But I think the changes afoot that you can see in the UK and the USA particularly, in terms of Western self-understanding and Western civilization and what we're calling the culture wars, you know, I think they are very, very significant. And we're at a moment which could end up being as influential on the 21st century as the immediate post-war period was for the remainder of the 20th century.
I mean, obviously a black hole can't really be reversed, and maybe they did it in Red Dwarf, but I don't think we can. But do you feel in this situation the West can kind of research?
I think we've got to think that, really. I think the alternative's too awful to contemplate, really. I think I suppose it's whether it's research or rebirth through a period of decline and questioning. I don't think, in terms of what we all understand as meaningful constructive life, I don't know what kind of social order could replace what we catch under that catch-all of Western civilization, and I don't know what that could possibly look like. I'm a Christian, so I think Christianity can never go. That's a faith conviction, yeah. And it will endure forever, and it can endure in different civilizational forms. But I don't think there's any other civilizational form that can do that, nor indeed guarantee, as I say, meaningful constructive life, really, certainly in this country going forward.
So your book, Obedience is Freedom, I thoroughly enjoyed it. So the obedience you're talking about is not so much like a dog obeying its master, but it's more about a set of values and how following those can open up freedom for us. I mean, can you talk us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I was provoked in part really to have the title in the book because the word obedience had become so toxic, yeah. Because people had this sort of dog and his master stereotype of it. Whereas actually simply to abnegate one's own will for the sake of the will of another, or indeed another cultural subject, if you like the nation or the family, etc., seemed to me to be something that we need to be doing all the time in order to have a much freer form of life. And actually, at the more extreme ends of the identity politics world, you get this sort of anti-all norms type mindset. There's such a thing as a family abolition movement, for example. And, you know, in my youth I'd known many anarchists and people that had sort of experimented with these kind of extreme forms of anti-authoritarianism, and they ended up the most restricted, enslaved, limited people I've ever met in my life.
Well, they thought they were doing it to kind of free themselves.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And similarly, if you look at people who celebrate obedience in a very one-sided sort of way, the most obvious examples of totalitarian regimes, the upper echelons of those societies often become completely chaotic and bizarre, yeah, as a result. So it was interrelating the two that I found very interesting. And in my own life, I'd found that things like marriage and family and career and all the limitations that went with that, you know, those externally boring life choices actually made me feel far, far freer than I'd felt when I'd sort of, you know, gone off the rails and tried to make everything fun.
So each chapter kind of has a different concept. I mean, one that I found particularly interesting was the authority one. You quote Hannah Arendt. I guess the disappearance of the traditional establishments of authority has been one of the most spectacular characteristics of our modern world. I mean, what role does authority play in today's society?
Well, in today's society, I think it's almost gone. Hannah Arendt is clear that authority is not coercion or force. Coercion or force is what happens when authority has ceased to be active. Genuine authority simply compels of itself without the need for any coercion, or the threat of force even. And I think we have more or less lost that. I mean, at the time of writing the book, I could mention things like the police and the military, where there was still a residual presence of that, which there must be on the battlefield. There has to be on the battlefield, but generally, you know, the police and the military have become sites of ideological conflict in recent years. So I think you get it to a certain degree in the religious world, but the sort of genuine authority that I wanted to try and to bring out and lead people to reflect on, whereby there's simply an unreflected presupposition that the person in a position of authority is right. I think that's very very hard to find today. You get it to a certain degree with parenting, where there's that vast asymmetry between the young child and the parent. But even now, I can't remember if I mentioned it in the book, but certainly talking about the book, I've ended up talking a lot about my experiences of becoming a parent and being told that you had to be contemporary parenting has to be very peer-to-peer, and you have to get away from this asymmetrical understanding of superiority.
Kind of on the same level.
Exactly, kneel down to the same level. Never say to a child, if they say, "Why do I have to do this?" Never say, "Because I said so."
Well, my parents loved that one.
Exactly, yeah. And this is why I'm trying to bring it back, because there's something very important in that, saying, because this is the authoritative position, and you will respect it, and actually I don't need to give an account to you, because you're 3. as to why you can't eat a limitless number of Smarties or something. And I think that, I think what I would really invite people to reflect on is the benefits of having that sense of authority, and not to immediately rush in and say, well, what happens if the authority goes awry? And that's very much the liberal social contract assumption that we have, that authority needs to be kept in check all the time. Well, proper authority doesn't. In a society that has a genuine sense of the good and a transcendent rootedness, authority isn't intrinsically prone always to be toxic.
So what you say is kind of accepting, there's moral guidelines, there's limits on behaviour, and if people were like that, they would be more free than they think they are.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just about feeling free. I mean, I think people express themselves best when there's a measure of limitation. Something that came up a lot in discussions of the book was people talking about jazz music, for example, and how a jazz musician will, the classic generation of jazz musicians, including Miles Davis and the others, were all trained in, fully trained in all their scales and theories and all the rest of it. And this gave them the ability to do this very free-flowing and spontaneous stuff. And I think the ability for us to be fully creative and spontaneous and fully engaged with life in a really rich and deep, meaningful way is completely dependent on our ability to have solidarity with others through ongoing commitments and responsibilities.
So one other issue I wanted to ask you about, we saw the kind of relaunch of Notre Dame, and it's kind of being put forward as the resurgence of Christianity is happening. It's a really important signifier. I mean, what was your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a wonderful achievement. I can see why people got so excited about it in terms of simply in terms of an infrastructure project being pulled off with such panache. We need to remember that I think Macron wanted a slightly different Notre Dame early on. We need to be realistic about that. I mean, there was, I think, some move to have some sort of modern prayer space and all that kind of stuff. But what happened and the speed in which it was done was, if anything, inspiring. I hate to say it, pains me to say it, but inspiring for us here, because we don't really seem able to build anything like that sort of nationally, publicly anymore. I think it's an interesting moment insofar as there's the recent election result in the States. It's often commented that there's a vast number of, or a significant number of, public intellectuals and commentators who are either flirting with Christianity or converting than there have been for a while. So the discourse is far more Christian than it's been at any point in my lifetime. And that was something I never expected as being a theologian. I never thought there'd come a time where theology would become part of the kind of chattering culture, if you like. And that's combined with a decline in religious practice, so it's a very strange moment where there's sort of new secularism and a new Christianity going on at the same time. But I think, Notre Dame is a wonderful achievement, and if it ends up becoming an emblem of a sort of new era for Christian faith and belief, then that'd be a wonderful thing.
Jacob Phillips, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.